Hey everybody, what's good? What's going on? JB here, back with part 3 of my network automation CI/CD pipeline breakdown. If you've seen any of my previous 2 videos covering this topic, it was something that was new to me that I wanted to kind of get my hands into and kind of learn some of the basics and different tools that go along with DevOps and CI/CD pipelines. Today's video is going to be pretty interesting because we're going to be building on top of the previous tools and scripts that we did in the other videos. So what we're going to be doing is simulating being a network admin who is able to pull down the repo from GitHub, end up making their own changes within an own branch that they create off of the main branch, push that back up to GitHub. When they do that, we're going to have a script that's going to end up spinning up another container to do some checks. Then we're going to create a pull request up on GitHub, which will allow the higher level network engineers to review things, make sure everything looks good. Once they approve that, then it's going to kick off another script, which then is going to implement those changes. And we will, at that part, have completed the admin to engineer review and implementation phase of our CI/CD pipeline. So let's go ahead and move over into the VM. We can do a little quick recap of where we left off in the last video and then hop over into the new stuff. So this should look somewhat familiar to you. This is what we've been talking about the previous few videos. So really starting off here as a user and engineer. In the first video, we ended up creating our GitHub repo. We ended up using ngrok to allow us to have a public IP to interface with what in essence are our CI/CD workers that are actually implementing all the different things in our pipeline, which is a drone server and drone runner. Remember, the drone server is what actually interacts with GitHub, and the drone runners is actually what spins up and manages the containers. After we got all that in place, I think that was in video 1, we ended up working on creating a drone YAML configuration file in the last video. And what we ended up doing with that was adding a few different pre-checks to the CI/CD pipeline. We ended up doing a black Python code format check just to make sure all the different scripts that we were using are adhering to correct Python standards. We ended up implementing a Batfish container and a Batfish script, which ended up looking at a few different types of network configurations and misconfigurations that we could possibly have to deal with. I think we were specifically looking at some BGP stuff, some OSPF stuff, some interface configuration things. And that was kind of where we left it at the end of last video. I think if we go back and look kind of in our drone server here, and we can kind of see this is what we did. We pulled down the repository from GitHub, ended up having the different scripts that end up coming down with that, and then based off of that YAML configuration file, depending on what we had in there, kicked off some different things. And you remember, as we were working through that, we were doing that in an iterative fashion. We're going to continue doing that today. But we had the black code format check, which was looking at all the different Python scripts that were in the repo. Then we had this Batfish check. Remember, there was a container that we had to spin up as well for this. And this was just looking at, as I mentioned, a bunch of BGP stuff, looking for duplicate router IDs. And then once that passed, then we had another Python script. I think I was just using a netmiko script that was logging into one of the network devices in the lab and just running some simple show commands. Just for the purpose of showing, as we work through this, you can have additional scripts there doing different things. Now, when we got to this point in the last video, I mentioned that the Batfish check was great, but it only looks at certain things, and we're going to need to really have something that's going to allow us to see what the changes are that are being made when we go to make these different types of network configuration changes, and need something that's a little bit more holistic in looking at everything. Now, if we go back to the blog series that we've been working through, we did this from our friend JulioPDX, we can kind of pick up right where we left off. I think we were about halfway through part 4 in his blog series here. So what we're going to be looking at doing is implementing a napalm dry run. So this next few sections, we're going to be looking at Napalm and Nornir. I kind of mentioned it in some of the previous videos. Really, these are some specific Python modules that you can implement to help you with different types of network access and network monitoring, network configurations using Python. So let's kind of read through this and see what Julio was talking about. So Batfish is great, and he can catch a lot of things, but as I mentioned, if there's something that's not caught by Batfish as a configuration error, what are some other things that we can do? In this case, he ended up leveraging Nornir Napalm. Napalm has a Napalm configure task, which we end up using, that will attempt to send a complete configuration file to the network device. If it's not valid, it should report on an error. Remember, at this point, we're doing a pre-check stage. So we're trying to simulate a network admin who wants to make configuration changes and is submitting these configuration changes through this pipeline. So we don't want to actually go ahead and be implementing these changes yet. So there's this build.py script that we have. I think we can actually go and take a look at it here on my GitHub. We're going to kind of walk through the main things that are covered here, but it's pretty short. There's not a whole lot to it. The main things to point out here is that there's this dry run and no dry run arguments, and we'll actually be using these in our YAML configuration when we go to implement these different steps in that. Another thing that's worth pointing out here is there's this import Nornir set creds. Now, there's a few different ways that you could end up doing these configs or this particular script. You could hard code the credentials. Obviously, we don't want to do that. So what is helpful is this tools.py script here, and it has a definition for Nornir set creds. And I kind of modified the script a little bit so that we could end up using those secret variables that we talked about before in drone. So remember that we've done this in some of the other Python scripts where we ended up adding in this OS environ variable, and then ended up adding in this user and password secrets that we already have stored in the drone server. So in doing this and adding this to this particular script, the other script that we were looking at will end up referencing this and will end up allowing us to use the credentials that are stored in those secrets. So just something to be aware of. You can modify this if you want to however you see fit, or you could just statically assign your credentials in the script as well if you wanted to. But I just wanted to try to make things a little bit more secure, so we ended up going this way. So let's move back into that build.py script. We can see where we were actually calling that out. It was right here, this Nornir set creds was being called there. And here is the definition for deploy network for the task. We see again that it's pulling the config, what we actually want the config changes to be, from that snapshots configs directory that we created that was used by Batfish in the last video. So let's go back and see what else Julio was saying here. We can kind of read through this. The top portion of the scripts imports anything required to interact with Nornir Napalm. And then he's using the arg parse to create an argument within the script that will set the variables to true or false. As I mentioned, we're going to be using that here within the YAML config, where when we call this Python script for this dry run, it's not actually going to be implementing the config. And that's the important thing that we want to be doing before we actually have the permission and review through GitHub. So he goes through and actually tries doing some stuff here, adding in some fake information. And when he runs this, it ends up kicking back an error. I'm going to let you know that based off of the way that this is written at the moment, this will not work properly if you're using actual Cisco iOS devices. So when I do this, this actually passes So there's a few different things that we could look at doing to try to fix this in the future. We might have to try and find some other type of configuration check. But there still is value in running it this way, and that is because we're still able to see what the config differences are. And also, in still using it this way, it allows us to add in a step in the approval process before actually having things implemented on the network. So he goes through and then he shows, how it would work properly. In his case, with the config not being something that is incorrect. So I think in his case, he's using EOS switches, which I think are Arista. So they look very similar to Cisco, but for some reason, this parsing works fine. So let's go dig in a little bit deeper because there's a few other things that we need to do before we actually implement this. But he doesn't cover it until part 5 in the blog. So we just want to make sure that we have this set up properly. All right, so then moving into this next part of the blog, talking about the challenge of standing up Nornir or Napalm. There's a few things that we're going to have to do that, again, are going to involve some other YAML files. So looking through the script that we were just looking at, we talked about importing the Nornir stuff, the Nornir set creds, which we already looked at that script. There's also some stuff here that we point to at this config.yaml. I think if we go back and look at this, right here is where it's in the script. So there's a few different files that we actually have to create here within this repo. So if we step back, they're very simple. It's nothing too crazy. So we're going to go under configs. You need to create a configs directory and these 3 files. First one is a config.yaml. We're just using the plugin simple inventory. And then we're going to be pointing to 2 other files, which are in the same directory, a host.yaml and a groups.yaml. And you can leave the runner configs just like this. Don't really need to do anything with that. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. This groups.yaml, pretty much, since I'm using Cisco iOS, this is what we needed to use here. What you do want to make sure is, depending upon what type of vendor that you're using, that you are checking the Nornir documentation on this to make sure that you're using the right syntax for whatever these are. So in Julio's case, if we scroll down, since he was using the EOS, it was EOS, right, instead of iOS. And the third file they had was this host file. And really all this is you're putting in host name, and then underneath that, the IP address, and then what group you're assigning that to. In this case, linking back to that Cisco iOS group. So pretty straightforward, nothing too crazy, but you do need to have those in place. And he kind of walks through a little bit more here. And then looking at the main functions that are within that script, the deploy network function, which we already looked at, and as I mentioned, is pointing back to that snapshots config. So you really don't need to modify anything within this particular script. Everything is fine. The only thing that I ended up modifying was what was in that tools .python script to end up being able to use those secret variables, and then also adding that configs file and those particular 3 YAML files. So let's actually walk through what this would look like if we wanted to make a change on the network here. So we're actually going to just clone the repo, and then we're going to create a branch off of that, and we're going to modify some of those files. Then we're going to commit, push that back up to GitHub. We're going to then do a pull request. I'm going to say why we're doing what we're going to be doing. When we do that, though, it's going to kick off a particular step in our CI/CD pipeline. It's going to be doing that initial pre-check. So as soon as we take that branch and we push it up, then it's going to kick that off. And we can take a look at that. And then once we approve the pull request, then it will actually go and implement the change, and we can see what that looks like. So let's let's go over first, before we do that, let's take a look at what that updated drone YAML file will look like. So again, with that, we're using PyCharm. That's what I've been using. It's great. So this is where we kind of ended the last video at. So just remember, we do the black code, the Batfish check. Remember that because it was taking so long, we ended up creating our own container. So we're going to continue to use those. But let's go and take a look at these two things that we're going to be adding over here. And we can move this over into the initial drone. So just walking through this. Again, this is going to be the pre-check. Remember, it's that build.py script. So the container will be spun up using this container image that we built out. We're passing those particular variables for username and passwords for it logging into the network device. Because that is something that is unique with this Nornir type of configuration where Batfish wasn't actually interactively logging into the device. Nornir obviously is, because that's what's going to actually end up being the one implementing the configuration change. So we go through this, and then as long as this passes, then it will move on to this next step here, which is actually deploying the configuration. It's the same script again, but in this time we're using this no dry run argument, which means it'll actually be implementing the configurations. Now, where this gets interesting is the way that we implemented this to only be doing this when its branch is master or main. So by us pulling down the repo and creating a new branch off of that, that will kick off this entire CI/CD pipeline, but this particular step here of actually implementing the configuration change won't happen unless the change is being made to the master or main branch. So that's why we're going to be pushing it back up and creating that pull request to be able to actually implement it back into the proper branch. And then at the end, we have this same script that we were running before, which is going to check the IP interfaces on one of the devices in the lab. Let's move over into the terminal here, and we can kind of walk through what Julio was doing here. So it just git clone, and then whatever the repo is that we want to pull down. We're going to clone that repo. We see that we have it there. I'm going to cd into it. Okay. And then we're going to go and create a branch from that, if you remember. So we're going to go and we'll go add loopback, was going to be the name of the branch. If we do a git status, and that shows us where we're at. So within this, we can now then go and modify that switch config. So we go snapshots, config. I think it's switch one text. So we can go down, find where this is at. We're going to add a new loopback interface here. We'll go loopback interface 3. Interface loopback 3. So with this, you just want to make sure that you're actually using the full syntax of what it is that you're typing in here. So no shortcuts as far as the commands like we would normally do on the CLI. Okay, and that should be good. So we're going to save that. And then I'm going to add it. Okay, we see that that's green. The text here is green. So then we can go and do the commit. And then we can go and actually do the push. Let's just make sure that we are doing all that. Yep, that looks good. Okay, now I'm just gonna log in. All right, and then that was pushed up there. So we should be able to go open this link and be able to create that pull request. All right. Phase 3, or we should say interface loop back 3 to switch 1. Create pull request. And there we go. We should be able to do that. We can go merge pull request. Okay, now we can go back over here to our builds. And we should see that new merge request coming in there. Matches up with what we saw from GitHub. It's going to go through and do its checks. Nothing should come up on the Batfish check. Pre-check config. Remember with this one, it's not actually going to give us an error, but we will be able to see what actual commands are being added or removed. So adding interface loopback 3. Should be almost done at this point. We should see something pop up. There we go. We see that the interface loopback 3 and the IP address is added. You'll also see nothing done on switch 2. And we see here that loopback 3 is now up on that switch. So we could just also run through the same process real quick as far as modifying that and pushing that up to remove an interface. So if we go back over here, we can go back into the config. We'll just remove loopback 3. Okay, and then we'll save that. And then we'll go through the same process again. I'm going to add removing commit and then push. And there we go, that popped up. Let's go back to GitHub. And you see here that it's going through the check that it normally would because we haven't approved that. And you see here it says the branch is one commit behind or one commit ahead of the master. So we're just going to open another pull request on that. So we're going to create the pull request. And go ahead and just merge that, removing loopback 3, confirm merge. Okay, and then we can delete the branch. Let's go back and take a look, make sure that that's coming in. So now it has the deploy configuration step after the pre-check config difference. All right, and that shows that it is going to be removing interface, loopback 3, and removing that IP address. We'll just wait for this to come through. And there we go. We see that that has been deployed, the no dry run. And if we go and check this, then we see that loopback 3 is no longer there on the switch. So that's about all I wanted to cover in today's video. That was adding in the actual configuration deployment section of the CI/CD pipeline. So we used Nornir and the Napalm modules within that to be able to do a dry run, see what configs were going to be pushed to the device, have that end up being pushed up to GitHub, which allows us to do a pull request and allows us a little bit of oversight into the changes that are being automated on the network. As long as everything looked good, then we hit OK, which ended up kicking off the CI/CD pipeline process again, and this time actually doing the configuration on the device itself, and then the script at the end ended up showing that the interfaces were either added or removed. I think that if we just take a look at what Julio had in his blog, I think that pretty much covers everything here. The last thing that we do have, and we'll do a bonus video on this, is talking about SUSIQ, which is a pretty interesting post-validation check software that allows us to gather information from devices in real time. It's pretty cool. I played around with it a bit, but a little bit more configuration is going to go into that. So We'll do a bonus video that covers all of that next. All right, so that's going to wrap up this video. I hope that you find this stuff interesting. Go check out Julio's blog. I have the link for it in the description. Check out my GitHub. You can pull down the configs and scripts that I've used through this. If you have any questions or comments, please throw them down below. Smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, all that other good stuff. Go get at it, and we'll talk soon. All right, bye.